Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Alaska del Sur wash processed Ecuador from Identity Coffee Lab. And there's the box right there. And Identity, based out of Seoul, South Korea. And this is part 5 of our 7-part series featuring the 7 Korean coffees from our most recent blind taste test rankings video. And if you watched that video, then you saw that this coffee finished 3rd place out of those 7 coffees on that day. And the main reason I was able to pick this coffee out from the other coffees on that table was because it did offer a slight herbal and citric quality that is typically associated with Sidra coffees. Now, when initially making this purchase from Kumquat, this is the coffee that I was most excited about, as it is an Alaska del Sur coffee, and we did review their Mejorado from George Howell last year and very much enjoyed it. So I certainly had some high expectations for this coffee going into it, and we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 53. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a slightly toned down recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So this one was actually the lightest of the coffees that we are reviewing in this series, and that's still to say that it's not necessarily an overly light coffee, as I feel like since we reviewed an Alaska del Sur coffee from George Howell last year, it's possibly best to kind of compare it alongside that one, as I would say that the profiles of these two coffees are pretty similar, which I feel like most people would align with being on the light medium side of that profile. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 32 blind taste test today, and the cup did stand out for an interesting bit of brightness as well, but also a bit of the pronounced citric and floral qualities to it, as it performed relatively well given that there was a nice bit of sweetness to the cup in general. So definitely plenty to pick out from that initial impression. Day 34 through the Chemex, and it was definitely offering a slight bit of a developed quality. Once again, none of these Korean coffees were overly light by any standard, but this one right here offering that was perhaps a little bit different from what I might have expected overall given the initial impression of it. But the rest of the cup is quite flavorful, including a pretty notable spiced quality that's very much in line with the listed eucalyptus. Once again, we are working with a Sidra coffee, and even the Alaska del Sur Mejorado that we reviewed last year had a pretty notable and distinct herbal quality to it as well. Surprising bit of brightness and citric qualities as well. So overall, a mixed first couple of days. Day 35 through the April brewer, and the cup is a little different as it still has that slightly lingering developed quality in the finish, and that's something that once again I experienced as I'm drinking on this coffee today, because it's there, it's not quite as prominent and pronounced as some of the other coffees in this series, but even then it does slightly impact the overall results, mostly in the finish within this coffee. The spiced component continues to remain the most unique aspect of it as well, as it's almost reminiscent of what I would describe as being aloe vera. They do have eucalyptus listed on here, but once again, it's just this kind of interesting herbal tone to it. There's plenty of stone fruit in the aroma, but a little less present within the cup itself, as it continues to offer a bright finish with that slight developed quality to it. Day 38 through the V60 with some slightly lower temperatures, and it continues to remain pretty consistent as it's offering plenty of the herbal aspects yet again, and a slight bitter floral vanilla quality to it too. And from this point going forward, that's something that's going to be perhaps a little bit more pronounced within this coffee, as this adjustment really seemed to accentuate that quality while toning down some more of the roastier aspects of it, because I didn't necessarily experience that much of it, and I feel like it only took a slight tinkering to kind of dissipate that less positive attribute of this coffee. The previously mentioned aloe vera-like aspect once again did seem pretty prominent within it once again, but overall an okay day all around. Day 41 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the cup was the best it had been to this point, as it has helped curtail these slightly developed qualities, and that's what I had previously mentioned. It was a little less prominent and pronounced through the V60, but then with the same adjustments through the Chemex, it was all but gone, though still at the tail end of the finish, I'm experiencing that ever so slightly. Notably cleaner profile, as it's in line with the floral qualities, as once again I would say that slightly bitter vanilla-like tone to it, a floral vanilla pretty well pronounced within the cup itself. Also a bit of sweeter fresh fruit as well, with some nice definition to the plum-like attributes, so a lot of positives to take away. Day 44 through the V60 with the lower extraction adjustments, and continues to offer that sweeter, fresh fruit aspect in terms of the citric sense. I think they have an orange note list on here. Makes perfect sense. Once again, I usually get a lot of citric tones when it comes to Sidra coffees in general. Florals and that slightly herbal mint-like qualities present yet again. Slightly sweeter floral aspects this time around, as I somewhat curtailed a little bit of the bitter quality to it. Day 47 through the Chemex, and it's nice again. This time I can add a slight caramelized aspect to it as well, which at times I can also experience with Sidra coffees, maybe not to the same extent as Mejorado coffees, but even then it's pronounced enough, with the cup offering a cleaner floral vanilla profile and that lingering herbal aspect yet again. Cup has been mostly consistent, but it's been better defined with these slight adjustments and preferred brew method. Day 50, final notes we have through the Chemex one more time, and it's been very consistent with the most prominent aspects remaining the floral vanilla, caramelized sweetness with more of the lingering herbal qualities, and I mostly ran out of space for notes to continue. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those. And we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. And in case you haven't noticed, it's been a little hard to come by in terms of the cleanliness scoring level 4 for a lot of these Korean coffees. But this one definitely was justified at that mark, as the profile of the coffee is pretty well defined. And while it may have been slightly hindered by a very slight developed quality within the finish, it wasn't enough to the point to deter the overall results of this coffee, as I would say the florals are pretty well defined. The fruit aspects in it are also pretty well defined, and then that caramelized candied sweetness to it is also pretty well defined. So a lot of the attributes within this coffee are pretty pronounced and clean in general. Finish, level 4. And I mentioned the herbal quality that seems to linger a fair bit within this coffee, and I continue to go back to that slightly developed quality to it as well. But those two things, I would say, while they're not necessarily stuff that I seem to pursue, they at times were overpowered and overruled by the slightly more caramelized sweetness to the cup as well. And when I was experiencing that component to it, it definitely made up for some of the less desirable qualities for me. Sweetness, level 4. I have to say that I'm very happy with Sidra coffees that do score level 4 in terms of the sweetness, and especially if they're not just purely in the citric sense, because I could have fully expected this one to maybe be a little bit more on that citric side of things. But once again, that candied sweetness did seem to help the fruit profile that also offered plenty of sweetness to it as well. Florals, level 4, and that also happens to be on the slightly sweeter side of things, as having that sort of vanilla floral aspect to it definitely seemed to help, as I would say that the florals were probably the most pronounced and consistent note within post. I want to say the day, 40 mark, when we first made the lower extraction adjustments, and that seemed to shine through a little bit better than it had in some of the earlier days. So that being said, it was definitely the most pronounced profile that we have on this tasting wheel as we look through the rest, and then from there we go to the level 3s. And we'll start with the acidity, level 3. Not necessarily the most amount of brightness, though initially, as I kind of mentioned, the fruit brightness of it stood out, at least relative to the coffees on that table that weren't the Kenyan coffees. So that was interesting, as it offered a little bit more of that citric sense to it. Citrus fruit scoring at that level 4, correction, level 3. And as I mentioned going into it, I fully expected this one to maybe be a little bit more in line with that citric tone, but having it score there at the level 3 is fine by me. I don't really need these Sidra coffees to be overly citric to really enjoy them. Stone fruit, level 3. I would say that the plum attribute that they have listed on here, once again, not necessarily the most pronounced profile to it, but it didn't need to be, because there was enough within the rest of the coffee that made up for maybe the fruit profile not necessarily being the most intense quality. Caramel, level 3. Already mentioned that there's a very nice candied sweetness to it, and I can experience that from time to time with Sidra coffees, and I was very happy to experience that within this one. And then savoriness, level 3. Mentioned that there's that interesting herbal aspect in a slightly savory sense, that eucalyptus once again, just standing out a little different from a lot of coffees that we've reviewed in the past. And I'm wondering if that might be a theme with Alaska del Sur coffees, but I am currently in the process of working on a different one, so we will see if that ends up being the case. And then the final thing worth discussing is we'll discuss the smokiness too, but the body at the level 3 had a little bit more of a medium body texture to it. Always interesting when it is brewed with a Chemex, But yeah, we'll touch on the smokiness real quick at level 2. And I continue to mention that it's not anywhere near as pronounced as some of the other characteristics in this coffee, but it's something that I kept going back to time and time again. I think if we're really kind of discussing it, maybe we could use H&S's funk scale where they're like, okay, level 1, you get a slight bit of funk. I think that's kind of what I'm saying within this smokiness. It's like, it's there, you can detect it. It's not going to be to a level 2 where you're like, oh my God, this is really seeming to dominate and hinder the cup in general. But it's present enough to really notice it, and that's why it needed to be noted. But other than that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. When it comes to the coffees that we're discussing in this series, this one is definitely in the top 3. So it initially finished as one of my 3 favorite coffees, and by the end it definitely was one of my 3 favorite coffees. I feel like this is the one that has the most depth to it. So the next 2 coffees that we're going to be discussing, I mean, they are going to be the other 3 that finished as my top 3 favorite coffees. But there may be a little bit more one note than this coffee was, because there was a lot to pick out from this coffee. There was a fair bit more uniqueness to this coffee, and there was a lot to enjoy within it in general. So I think it just honestly depends on what I'm in the mood for when it comes to those coffees. Though there were some things and characteristics that stood out maybe a little bit more from those other ones. I would say that the highs from the other coffees were maybe a little bit better than the highs from this one. There's some nice attributes to it, but it doesn't reach that same high as those coffees were. That being said, it also doesn't seem to offer the same profile that I look for when it compares to those coffees, as those two seem to have profiles that are much more in line with my own preferences in terms of the flavor profile. But this one right here, as I kind of mentioned, I would say that maybe its floor was better than the other coffees, as it always seemed to offer plenty to pick out within the entirety of the coffee. So that's to say, it's no better or worse than the other 2 coffees that we're going to be discussing in our top 3, but at the very least, it definitely holds its own for being one of the more enjoyable coffees in this series. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I feel like if you've enjoyed Sidra coffees in general, then this one does offer a fair bit of those qualities, but most specifically focused on that slightly more herbal aspect to it. As I've heard in the past, people say that Sidra coffees just always seem to have that sort of eucalyptus-like feel to them. And that's why it did make me laugh originally purchasing this coffee and seeing that eucalyptus note on there, because I'm like, yeah, that's what people seem to get from it, whereas I seem to get so many citric qualities and tones to it. But that's the first place I would start with it. But in addition to that, if you like that kind of candied caramelized sweetness to your coffees, and this one also seems to offer a little bit of that as well. So that's the best direction I can point you towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try the coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Alaska del Sur wash processed Ecuador from Identity Coffee Lab. Thank you for watching.